Okay, well, welcome to the first content class of this weekly live stream. Today, we're focusing on Moon and Pluto. Okay, perfect. So as a reminder, when we move through these classes, the core intention is to actually have and cultivate a direct understanding of the actual relationship between these two planets. I think it's very easy in our studies to, think about aspects to Pluto and just to sort of land on these more abstract ideas. I want us to have a real felt sense of what is the moon about, what is Pluto about, and what's the actual evolutionary intention. When you see Mars and Pluto in a relationship in the natal chart, what's the intention? Now, of course, there's not a one-size-fits-all situation. The actual content, the dynamics will be different for every soul. But fundamentally, the moon in aspect to Pluto speaks to a very particular evolutionary intention that will play out differently and express differently, but it's such a valuable thing to grasp the nature of these two archetypal relationships. And I want to remind everyone too that it's not just about aspect. Everyone has Pluto and Moon in the chart. They are sharing a phase with one another. This is whether or not they're in an actual aspect. In this series, we're not necessarily going to be addressing the nuance and the detail of all the 8 phases and all of the aspects within them. Definitely check out schoolofevolutionaryastrology.com, the association class series on phases, and also my training program where we go a lot more deeply into all of that. For those that want to study this work and have more interaction with me, to practice, receive support in your practice and your studies, you can join my training program. We actually begin that program in a few weeks. Okay, so with that, let's dive in to today's class. Let's remember that anything in any relationship with Pluto speaks to an evolutionary process. The evolutionary process of change, that which comes, that which goes. Pluto is always pointing to a sort of impermanence. Everything's going to interact and be with us for a while, but nothing ever provides ultimate security. The truth of that is particularly difficult, maybe for every planet, but in particular when we're working with the moon. Because the archetype of the moon is specifically that which corresponds to the idea of security. More than any other archetype. Security expresses in different ways. Venus is more of a self-value, self-esteem, or physical security. The moon, we're looking at emotional security. So it's helpful to give some time to unpack what does that mean? What's the moon really all about? And I want to offer first the perspective that when we're dealing with Pluto and the moon, we're looking at 2 water archetypes, right? This is a part of the water trinity. And Jeffrey Wolf Green spoke about the water trinity as in total speaking to the nature of the emotional body. And one essential teaching in evolutionary astrology is that evolution happens through the emotional body. Whenever we're experiencing something, in order for it to be integrated and complete, in order to be able to actually grow from the experience, we need to digest it on an emotional level. And this is a real thing. When we emotionally digest something, it's integrated in a way where it informs our sense of self. It's able to impact us on the level of identity. Before something actually impacts us on the level of who we know ourselves to be, we're not able to integrate it. And this is essentially what the moon is all about. The moon is how we're able to emotionally integrate our experience, moment to moment. In life, we can say, from a Pluto perspective, fundamentally, is about change. And sometimes the change is startling and uncomfortable. Other times it's empowering and exciting. but it's change, and everything does fundamentally come and go. The moon is the present moment point of integration that says I'm coming from my experiences and to whatever degree the continuity and what is known of the past, and I'm moving into something completely unknown. How can I know myself here where I am? And I can't stress the significance of that. When we're looking at the moon, we can think of the metaphor, the correlation of children. Babies and children, they need for their emotions to have a place. And their emotions don't need to be logical. They don't need to make sense. You can argue emotions by their nature have nothing to do with logic, and it's inappropriate to associate the two. That's actually in a sense, you can say that's the inconjunct between Gemini and Cancer, 30 degrees. Our emotional reality is how we're coping with experience in the moment. I'm hungry. What do I do about being hungry? Right? I hurt myself. I'm lonely. What do I do about that? Right? Before we're even able to cognitively process our reality, give it a story, or have some sort of like larger intellectual framework for understanding. I'm lonely. I feel sad, but mommy's going to come home soon. She's just in the other room for a moment. Prior to that maturation, there's just the experience of the emotion itself. And we're not necessarily feeling the emotion. I'll delve into this when we connect with Venus, but there's a difference between emotions and feelings. That which we feel is implicit to our relationship, right? So for feeling something, we can feel an emotion, right? But feeling is, I'm in relationship to something. It's of the senses, whether it's internal or, I can feel something happening. Right? We're not feeling things on a purely emotional level when it comes to the moon. It's just emotion. It's important to understand that because adults, we develop our feeling body, and we're able to then have more of a conscious relationship to the emotional process and even communicate our needs and feelings. That's again a Libra Venus thing. But on a purely lunar level, it's just the emotional experience of being a deeply vulnerable soul, a vulnerable being that needs to be cared for. And there's an inherent need and expectation within all beings that you're going to be cared for, meaning it comes with the basic human soul emotional biology of this experience. We're born, we're going to be held. There's going to be a certain threshold of care and nurturance that will come with our experience. The expectation of that is built into our biological being, right? Children, babies will die if they're not held, enough in the early days, or if they're neglected for a long period of time from the very beginning. Like there's an actual need for that care. Now, not one of us on our soul journey has received the perfect care. What is it like for our lunar emotional needs not to be fundamentally cared for? You're crying, you have a need. There's a need for care and attention. There's a need to know that you're important, that you belong, that you're wanted, right? And then you're experiencing to some degree that need isn't being acknowledged, that need isn't being met. And here's the interesting thing when it comes to the moon. It's psychologically, it's absolutely fascinating. And I think understanding this can actually really help us to just appreciate how we each find a way of coping with our experiences. And then when we look at our lunar archetype, where our moon is placed in all of its aspects, we can really appreciate it's the unique experience of each person. And this is why. Because of the need for continuity and security, when our fundamental needs for care and emotional attunement isn't met, we're not going to be able to emotionally integrate the truth of that at first. It's impossible for a child to be able to cope with the reality of their needs not being attended to. They definitely won't be able to intellectualize or empathize with mother or father or whatever. So there's thus a need for them to create an ego structure, to understand themselves, to form an image of themselves that will allow them to adequately cope with a lack of nurturance and care. And we've all experienced that on some level. And this is so essential to the development of the ego structure, to the moon. In this work, we really consider the moon to correspond to the ego structure. And when we speak to the idea, thank you, of an ego structure, it's nothing other than how we as a soul project an image of ourselves. Who do I know myself to be? What's my self-concept? So because we can't control the external environment, and we don't have the ability to emotionally integrate the greater emotional complexity of why parents are or are not available, or why things are happening, or why change or loss or difficult things happen, right? The immediate and necessary response is to structure and accommodate our self-identity around our experiences. So we build a complex for ourselves very early in life in order to maintain a sense of continuity and safety. And these can be very subtle, but it's fundamentally built around if I'm fundamentally not getting my core emotional needs met, or if there's something in my experience that is devastating and hard for me to integrate and emotionally recuperate, I'm going to have to find a way of dealing with that. So let's say a Taurus moon structure, and I'm speaking very generally, will learn how to isolate themselves or draw deeply within themselves and live in their own world. So I'm going to create my own bubble of emotional continuity and security, but at the same time, I'm going to sort of block everything that's hard out. Why? So I can feel safe, so I can feel secure. Contrast that with a Scorpio moon, and as we'll speak, let's say a Pluto moon, strong Pluto moon aspect, I need that bonding that I'm not getting. So I'm going to find a way of bonding with the dysfunctional parental figure that isn't giving me what I need. So do you see the difference between the two? And just think of any particular lunar archetype, and this will be further, there'll be more of a particular complex or more specific content to look at and unpack, of course, if there are strong aspects to the moon. But what does this all say? It says this soul journey, and the way that I see it is we are souls, we are these eternal beings having this human experience. And the human experience is the template for our ongoing evolutionary growth. It's all deeply profound and deeply relevant. So it says the ways in which we're forming in this lifetime a particular self-image and learning how to emotionally integrate and work with our experiences, fundamentally, from the understanding of the soul's evolutionary journey, it's all a part of this ongoing evolutionary growth. It's not always easy to understand that. And again, I always say this, we never want to use the difficulties or challenges that we have in life as a reason to say, well, it's your karma or whatever. It's not the point of me saying this. But from a more compassionate understanding, and where we can use astrology as a sort of entry into this, we want to appreciate that our experiences, one way or another, are relevant. And thus, if we even go deeper, they're relevant, and fundamentally, they are exactly what we need for our soul growth. But the key is to be able to unlock its gifts. The key is to be able to unlock the spiritual and evolutionary potential in these difficult experiences. So this is what the moon is. And one more thing I'll say to introduce the moon. As we mature, as we grow, there's a need to be able to accommodate to more complexity in life, which means to be able to build a sense of self that is able to withstand the complexity of life experience. And we all do that, right? We eventually grow the capacity to, be in a relationship and for someone to look at us a certain way, and we don't have to embellish the thoughts of insecurity. We can, okay, maybe they're having a hard day. I don't have to take it personally. I can regulate myself. I can feel my emotions. I can be with myself, and I'm okay, right? We can try something new and even notice, I'm afraid I'm going to be rejected or I'm not going to be loved, but I'm going to take my time. I'm going to do some practices this morning. I'm going to breathe slowly and know myself. I'm going to talk to this person that I feel really safe with later on. I have friends in my life. Like there's always that threshold between the continuity of the known that we can rely upon and then that which we can't really rely upon, that which we don't know. We don't know if it's going to be secure. We don't know if we're going to be safe. All of those things, right? Walking that edge between the continuity of the known and the unknown is the lunar journey. And how to maintain a sense of ground and security within ourselves while we're also maturing into, this is new. I've never been here before. Can I be safe? Am I loved here? Am I okay here? What's complicated, however, when we really unpack the moon archetype is we often don't realize that we're taking the same defense complexes, the ways that we've learned to maintain safety as a child, into our adulthood, right? So in order to stay safe when things feel unsafe, we're going to sustain the ego structure, the way that we've come to know ourselves, and thus the way that we relate to the world. And think of the moon as our film projector. It's the very subjective lens that we're looking out to look at the world, right? And so we're going to default towards these patterns of behavior. And that's where this sort of reparenting process becomes very essential when we do deeper lunar work. Not every chart speaks to the need for that, right? Not every chart will reflect a lifetime where the core evolutionary theme constellates around deeper moon work. When you have a strong aspect between Pluto and the moon, it does. So let's delve into that right now. And the way that I'm going to do this, I'm going to maybe just sort of do my thing. I'll take a moment maybe based on what I've shared so far and see if there are any clarification questions. And then after I give the whole talk, I'll come back to the comments. This is so much fun for me. Sorry for the endurance of my loud cough. It's probably really loud on the mic. It's really fun for me to be doing this and to have the comments up. This is great. Okay. So we're also going to give a few examples of charts, which I'm excited to use to sort of exemplify these teachings. So when we're looking at strong aspects between the moon and Pluto, oftentimes, and it's never a one-size-fits-all, we're going to have experiences of core and fundamental emotional betrayal or abandonment, right? So that literally speaks to where there's that need for, with the moon, healthy attachment. And those attachments become a form of fundamental dependency, and then there's an abandonment or a betrayal of that. How we deal with that abandonment or that betrayal, where there's an underlying sense of fundamentally I'm being rejected. Oftentimes, this can express as the nurturing figures, often mother, but not necessarily or only just mother, right? Moon does correspond to mother in a very direct way, right? It's the woman who has the pregnancy, who gives birth, right? It's a very practical, the breast for feeding. But more broadly, the moon also can correspond to the nurturing imprinting in general, not exclusive to mother. And it's important to understand both of those pieces. When those basic needs aren't being met, what happens is, in order to maintain that security and continuity, the soul is going to become progressively and psychologically fixated on whatever way of understanding itself is necessary in order to maintain and secure its own sense of feeling loved and cared for. So this can mean I'm needing to form a close relationship to those who aren't caring for me or loving for me. So I'm going to become very psychologically attuned to the emotional energy of, let's say, my parent or my mother, right? So that I can make sure that I am being cared for by them, right? Pluto Moon people can become very psychologically aware of their environment as a result of that. If I'm not getting the basic care and need that I need and expect, I'm going to become acutely attuned to the emotional and psychological reality of those around me. so I can accommodate myself to that. But fundamentally, there's a sense of unsafety. I don't actually know that I'm going to get my basic needs met. So I'm going to become expert. Pluto, laser focus, concentration. On this evolutionary journey, we develop profound concentration skills as a part of whatever evolutionary dynamics we're working out. So I'm aware of what's going on. And that's a way of protecting myself. So I make sure that I know how to act and I know how to behave, so that I'm going to receive the basic nurturing imprinting that I'm needing from my parents, because otherwise they're not going to give it. Now, on that model, what's going to happen throughout their life? This soul might find themselves in relationships where there's a fundamental patterning of being abandoned, betrayed, their core emotional needs not being met, and them putting themselves in a situation where they're forming an ego structure around, I gotta make sure that I'm accommodating to the intensity and the unreliability and the instability of my partners, right? Or my spouse, or the people that I'm close with. I'm going to form these bonds, but I'm not actually going to feel a deep sense of safety. Now, if we go deeper into that, if that individual begins to unravel their emotions, we'll see, okay, I've learned how to become deeply sensitive and attuned to my environment so I can make sure I'm being cared for and I'm tending to others. But underneath that, I don't actually know that I'm worthy and deserving of being loved and cared for. So the manifestation of being with individuals that are either emotionally manipulative themselves or have really strong, intense, and dysregulated emotional experiences that the Moon Pluto person knows how to navigate with great keenness. What if I don't navigate it, right? What if I'm not enmeshing myself in another person's deep emotional processes? Will I actually be cared for? Can I trust that I'm also going to be loved and wanted if I'm not emotionally entangled in this way? And this is a big part of the Pluto work in general. We will often find ourselves psychologically enmeshed and entangled in various people, places, experiences, addictions, patterns. And to actually unravel them really means becoming psychologically aware of, why am I entangled in the first place? Or why do I keep on attracting these kinds of relationships and experiences with people that have a lot of intensity and I'm not being cared for? And there are two modalities here with Pluto aspects in general, and this is the one that I'm presenting. We can find ourselves in relationship to people, place, experiences where the intensity and possessiveness and darkness even of Pluto is expressed outside of ourselves, because we're not in touch with our own shadow, right? I have a need to be deeply cared for. I have a need for someone to track my psychological reality, to be deeply attuned to my own inner experience, right? But because I don't know myself as deserving of that, I've learned how to maintain that intimacy by tracking that of another. So other people are going to be holding that deep need and intensity that I myself have not claimed. Okay? That's one expression, but let's go to the other expression, right? Moon Pluto aspects can easily reflect the very opposite. In order to receive the fundamental care and attention that I need, I've learned how to be manipulative, to manipulate others to caring for me, to manipulate others to want me, to get the affection and care that I need. Very often, this will express on a sexual level. It's not necessarily or only just sexual, but when we're dealing with Pluto, we're looking at a fundamental need for, it's the draw for a deep sense of security and closeness. And we're going to be forming a strong attachment to whatever object focus or experience we believe that we need. So there can be a strong sense of, in order to feel a deep sense of bonding, I want to get really close, right? It's like that deep sense of close on a lunar level. I'm loved, I'm secure, I'm wanted, I'm held, right? Linked with Pluto is, I need that, right? So there can be a lot of unconscious psychological manipulation going on here. That is a way that the soul may have learned to receive the core care and attention that they need. Now, fundamentally, these are all things that the soul will have to learn to work out as they grow throughout this journey. And what's the core evolutionary intention? Like, what's the underlying soul intended growth with Moon Pluto? It's for the soul to learn how to become emotionally self-reliant within their own soul. Or to say this differently, how we are learning to become at home, to be secure within our own soul. I'm at home in my being, my beingness, the state, the fact of my inherent security. That's where I'm concentrating. The fact of my security. I'm at home in what I actually am. That's a resilience, right? We can say Moon Pluto is where we're learning a sort of emotional resilience and strength, where we can open up, we can share, we can have deep connection, but there's a sense of whatever happens in life, right? Whatever the comings and the goings are, I'm responsible for my own needs. I'm responsible for my own emotional experience. Other people aren't responsible, or life isn't, or my parents aren't. And that takes time, right, to get to that point, because we're dealing first with a lunar reality where we don't yet have early in life the ability to objectify that. Thus, to form that soul level resiliency and self-reliance, it says two things, and these are two simultaneous tracks that are really important to understand. There's often a necessity to learn how to brood and be with the intensity of one's inner experience. The state of brooding, not in a negative way, is sort of just being with the experience. Prior to the just being with oneself are the complexes that are running the show, right? And the deep attachments and the compulsions. Often not getting what we want, or sort of being thrown back to ourselves, becomes the gateway to just finally come home and to stop trying, to stop resisting. And what happens, Moon Pluto will often have a very strong psychological capacity to be able to ask themselves, why am I experiencing this? That's the Pluto question. Why is this happening? We don't ever ask why from the point of view of something that doesn't actually take us within, right? That the answer to the why will actually draw us deeper into our soul. Why is this happening? What's the intention? What's the growth here? And we're always going to realize a threshold of greater power and strength than we knew that we had. And if we're only focused on the point of addiction, that which we depended upon, that which we needed, if that was our only concern, and it was never about not getting, if it was never about going back to ourselves, we would actually never realize our capacity for resiliency and strength. We would never awaken to the true dimension of our soul. At the same time, the other track is, okay, I see that there's this soul journey here of cultivating greater emotional stability and strength and resiliency and being at home within my own soul. But to do that, I have to be willing to look head on at the addictive patterns, right? Where my consciousness is concentrated on people, place, experiences that are not actually helpful or serving my soul growth. So we're going to be giving a lot of concentration to our relationships, to our core needs, to the longing, to the loneliness, to whatever soul dynamics are hard and perpetuating themselves in our life. And the path would be, how can I create a human life where I'm neither depending on and giving my power away to that which I cannot depend upon, but nor am I jading myself and hiding myself from the necessity of experience, right? Learning how to be vulnerable, learning how to share, how to give, how to form attachments, how to experience strong bonding and to experience strong loss, how to get close but then to stay centered in oneself. These are all also a part of it. That track says it's a part of the evolutionary journey as human beings that we're going to experience bonding. We're going to have family. We're going to form strong bonds and trust relationships with other people. And we can often find ourselves going into either extreme, and it depends on our unique makeup and our soul path and what the karmic dynamics are. The distrust jadedness isn't necessarily an expression of that soul empowerment. It can be, I don't want to get hurt again. Right? So that's sort of like the Plutonian metaphor of just wearing dark clothing and not wanting to get out into the light. In that way of being, not only are we not really allowing ourselves to develop that true soul self-reliance and that resiliency, we're actually going to find ourselves deeply brooding over unresolved content, okay? Brooding over the past, brooding over certain emotional or sexual addictions or desires that are unmet, but not necessarily willing to truly cultivate emotional vulnerability. There's oftentimes, this is an interesting thing to understand about Pluto, there can often be a sort of entitlement within a Pluto archetype, and the entitlement being, I expect that things are going to work out. And when they don't, I'm going to feel very jaded and hurt. And that's just one possible psychological expression. Oftentimes there's a maturation within any kind of Pluto expression to realize, yeah, life means things will change. Things will come and go. Dependencies upon people, places, and things are not necessarily always going to work out forever. Deal with it. Meet it. Learn how to be vulnerable. Learn how to ask for what you want. Learn how to express your needs. Learn how to let things go. Learn how to grieve. Learning how to create the necessary family support structures in our life, Moon, with a recognition that we also can't depend on it alone, solely, exclusively. It's this beautiful journey, and that's sort of the complexity of the Moon in general. We both need to be cared for, and we also need to perpetually grow more and more into our own matured self-care capacities. So oftentimes with Pluto Moon, there's a need to kind of get out of the shell of darkness, be vulnerable, cope with experiences, and learn ways in life. And this can be practices, experiences, anything that the soul can merge into. Any experience that will allow for a deep emotional catharsis, right? So it might be, I'm really going to get into touch therapy. I'm going to take a course in, healing human emotions through touch. I'm going to learn how to discharge emotions very deeply. I'm going to meet the part of myself that has these deep needs but is feeling really distrustful by actually exploring some paradigm that's literally about meeting those needs, right? Going deeply into the kind of experiences that reflect the things that we've lost or have not gotten is a way of us learning how to find our ground within those experiences without losing ourselves, without getting lost, without being perpetually betrayed, nor without believing that we can't actually have experience either. In the same way, that need for experience that is consciously chosen is another way of saying there's a need for emotional catharsis. And I need to some way find a way to move my emotional energy in a way where I'm not destabilizing myself. Because that's the point. There can be a lifetime of destabilization, right? Through relationship, through family, it can even be regular encounters where the deep sensitivity and attunement to betrayal or loss, or the fact of people showing up in one's life, constantly getting close and then not being available, can be an ongoing process of emotional destabilization. But that's the shadow content that's not being processed. So having these deep cathartic experiences that are consciously embraced is a way of coming to terms with and emotionally processing the deep realm of unresolved emotional content. Now, for a lot of souls, this can be your art. This can be your creativity. This can be your writing. This can be your work. A lot of people, you'll see this in natal charts, who are creative souls that are deeply emotional, and they're working through some deep stuff. Pluto Moon. Fundamentally Pluto Moon. And it's helpful to recognize this is not always the case. very often the soul with Pluto Moon might abandon other people, right? We have the same dynamic. We often, not always, are in two sides of the same coin, right? The Pluto Moon is, I was not emotionally available for those that needed me because I perceive that emotional need as a form of entrapment. So maybe where there's the karma of having betrayed or abandoned other people. Very often, a Pluto Moon will find themselves throughout a single lifetime on both sides of the coin. And it's all about the process of the soul learning to tend to their own inner state of being at home and to form healthy emotional bonds where they're committed to seeing through that bond while also caring for themselves and meeting their own needs at the same time. The idea of commitment is very essential here, because commitment, in the way that I'm using it, says whatever, and this is oftentimes, since we're looking at the moon, parent-child, but you could have these kinds of bonds that are showing up in a new lifetime where you're not parent-child with that individual person, but let's say in composite chart or synastry, you have strong Pluto Moon contacts. Like, what's the contract here, right? Is to form a relationship. Let me take a moment and really find the words to express this. Where there isn't a betraying or an abandoning or a leaving behind of the other relative to the strong needs and intensity of the other. There's a recognition what the other is bringing up within me is reflecting the content or the fears of entrapment or fears of abandonment or betrayal within my own soul. The key is to be able to take full responsibility for one's own inner emotional dynamics and not leave these bonds untended to. Right? The commitment means whatever that looks like. Oftentimes there is the need to say, hey, we've played this out as long as we can. Now we need to learn how to form more self-reliance and a non-entangled experience within our relationship experiences. But that's very different than, whoa, that's intense, I'm going to walk away, right? Because that's walking away from something inside of our own selves. And we'll often find that if we're playing out a lifetime of being a parent, the content of our children will then reflect back to us our own Moon Pluto content, right? And the commitment here is being deeply present for another doesn't mean abandoning or betraying ourselves. If it does, there's Moon Pluto content that we haven't worked out in terms of our own ability to care for ourselves. Again, with that shadow piece, another person's intense emotional content can be reflecting where we haven't gotten our own needs met. And we might feel entrapped or stuck if we're tending to another person's intensity. So, one more thing that I'll say about this before we move into some examples is just the nature of compulsive need. And it's important to understand how compulsive need works with Pluto Moon, and it's a little bit different than Pluto other things. Like, compulsivity is a Pluto thing in general, but with Moon, it's a slightly different dimension. Because of the fact that when it comes to the Moon, we're dealing with how we form an ego structure early in life in order to accommodate ourselves around the lack of care that we might otherwise need. So we can really develop a strongly compulsive psychology that might be incredibly difficult to unravel, right? There would be a need to actually become aware of the compulsivity in the first place. And the reason why with Pluto Moon it's hard to become aware of compulsive behaviors is because of the fact that we've built an ego structure around it in the first place as a way to normalize and make ourselves feel safe. So we'll need a lot of feedback and emotional feedback from our own life experiences in order to become self-aware of that. I should say this too. Fundamentally, Pluto Moon souls ultimately have the capacity to become deeply psychologically self-aware beings because of the fact that we're building our self-concept around these deeper psychological compulsions. If we're becoming psychologically self-aware, we become aware of ourselves on psychological terms, meaning we can get to know ourselves and understand ourselves on a deep psychological level. And thus the ability to be with others, and that's the commitment piece. I'm with someone else and there are these strong needs, and wherever a particular relationship is meant to go, I can be with that and not be afraid because I know how to be with my own emotion. I can be with intensity, or I can be a soul counselor or a guide or a healer for other people, with other people. I can be there in their darkness, and I know how to stand strong because I know how to be in the midst of the darkness myself and still know who I am. I know that I'm safe because I know who I am. I fundamentally am at home in myself. And so I can be in the presence of intensity and help other people find their light. And it's a beautiful experience because I can bond with them, Moon. I can say, hey, I'm holding your hand, I'm with you, and I'm seeing you in your darkness, in your pain, and I'm just with you. It's like midwifing the soul. The ability to hold another and be with another, but without all that without all the compulsivity of the Pluto Moon, where maybe I'm forming a trauma bond with another person, right? And that's different. Forming Moon-Pluto trauma bonds are a way of saying, I'm going to help care and nurture you because that's how I've learned how to be cared for. And that allows me to feel safe and loved because I'm building a strong connection with you. This is different. This is, I'm whole. I'm not needing something from you. I'm not subconsciously and psychologically manipulating the situation to work out my own content. I'm able to simply meet you in your intensity because I know my own. I know how to live in the darkness. I can go to hell and still find out what's eternal and true. And oftentimes these souls have had a long path in really coming home to themselves, have really had a deep journey in learning how to meet their own content. Again, since these souls can become psychologically self-aware in a very deep way, it often has been through the journey of hard knocks. I think that's something Jeff Green wrote in his section on the Pluto book. There it is, yeah. A lot of these souls will learn that, emotional strength and resiliency because of their experience of having gone through I can't find the place exactly, the ping pong ball of instability that's ultimately taught them how to take full responsibility for their own inner reality. And I want to say, souls that are developing that can also still be working out their own complexes and their own addictive patterns and behaviors, but it's so empowering. Moon Pluto can have such a deep level of psychological self-awareness, more than any other Pluto aspect, because Moon is about our identity. So it's such a great capacity with Moon Pluto to really know, where am I coming from with this? Why do I really want this? What's the basis for this compulsion? So obviously these people can be good psychological workers in bringing a lot of benefit to other people. Okay, so let me see if there are any questions that I can tend to here. And then I want to give a couple examples. Okay. Can you talk about how evolution takes place through emotions versus feelings? Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is the difference between the Moon and Venus. I will come back to this when we do Moon-Venus. The nature of emotion and how we're evolving through the emotional body is literally the way in which we're allowing our sense of identity to be formed and shaped and molded. Feelings is our ability to feel safe or empowered, to have our feelings, to feel what we're feeling, to identify needs, to communicate needs. Feelings bring in the relationship realm, right? This is what I feel. This is what I need. This is what I want. Or I'm noticing how I'm feeling right now. How am I going to navigate that? But we need to actually emotionally integrate our experiences. It's different. We can have a feeling about our experiences. I don't think I really want that kind of experience. I don't know how I feel about that, right? That's Venus. That doesn't lead to evolution. That leads to the navigation of choice making and how we're choosing to orient from our values and finding balance in our life. And with Pluto involved, that's an evolutionary process. But when it comes to Pluto Moon, the evolutionary journey via the emotional body means we actually have to allow for a completeness of experience. There's no better way for me to exemplify this other than saying, you know, when my daughter is upset about something, she'll, as children often do, might have a tantrum, cry and scream and absolute intensity. And for those few minutes or more sometimes, that's all that's happening, right? No, I don't want to be held. Don't talk to me. Don't give me it. There's just the experience of that, right? And I can maybe identify, right, on an emotional level. It's the despair of whatever object focus I have that I'm not getting, or the thing that I need, whether it's mommy or the sugar or the food or whatever, right? Or I don't want daddy to leave. It's the despair of that loss. And that needs to be experienced. It needs to be experienced. But what happens? They experience it and then they're done. Children have an amazing capacity to have a complete emotional experience and to move on from it. She will be laughing and joking right afterward. It's going to be done. And as a child grows and matures, you really get more and more of a feel for how they do that according to their particular lunar archetype, like how they're working with that, right? And the pitfalls and the traps. We want to really nurture a child to have a full emotional experience. And there's a time where it's like, hey, let go, move on. That has its place. But more often than not, I think parents have a tendency to interrupt a full and complete emotional discharge because we were interrupted too. It's the emotional intelligence of the moon. Working with the moon in a healthy way is not something we've learned how to do very well. And that's why the need for emotional catharsis is so important in working with Pluto Moon. However that a catharsis happens, it's a way of just meeting it, right? I don't have a Pluto Moon aspect, but I have a Scorpio Moon, okay? So it shares the same archetype. I have a Scorpio Moon in the 3rd house. For me, writing and sometimes chanting is one of the most cathartic ways of me moving, and also being able to talk to someone where I can just access and allow all of the thoughts to express themselves. Right? There's a catharsis that happens for me in writing and articulation. I have a journal. I might write down very negative and dark things. Not because they're true, not because I want these things to happen or I think it's right, but because it's there. I need to give it expression. I need to somehow move that energy so it doesn't eat me up. I need to allow it to express itself so I can actually allow it to move through me. I needed a completeness of emotional experience. And then we're able to give it safe. I noticed that with children too. After that completeness of emotional experience is provided, there's a growing objectivity and awareness that happens slowly, right? This time I know daddy's leaving. I don't need to throw a fit, but I want to feel loved. So I want to make sure daddy gives me a hug and a kiss. Things like that. We all do that. We all learn how to navigate the intensity of our emotional needs with greater agency and maturity. Realizing, okay, I'm going to have to be vulnerable. I'm going to have to be insecure. That's a part of life. Moon Pluto, I'm going to be insecure. But how can I care for myself within that while facing the necessity of insecurity? So that's the journey of working with the moon. And that's the evolutionary process happening through the emotional body. The richness of that concept is beyond what I could express, right? That evolution happens through the emotional body is such a beautiful teaching to unpack. Okay. So let's take a look at a couple examples, and then I'll end this class with looking back at the questions here. Let's see if I can do this. Ready? I did it. Okay, this is so exciting for me. For those who have been doing my live streams, I've been trying to figure out how to get this thing going. Okay, so John Lennon is the first example that I want to speak to here. So notice there's the moon in Aquarius in the 10th house, opposite Pluto with Chiron. Okay, so obviously, I mean, there's no doubt about it. This moon Pluto is a very strong facet of his chart. It is also a T-square, a grand cross, really, with all the fixed signs and Saturn, Jupiter, Mercury as well. But we're just going to focus on the moon Pluto to simplify it. Basic biographical context: his father left early on, I think, traveling, and really wasn't really in his life. Wasn't a part of his life. So father's gone. He didn't live with his mother for much of his life, and his mother actually died when he was 17. So there's a sense of being betrayed and abandoned by his parents. So fundamental soul program here is Pluto Leo in the 4th house. This is already a very lunar archetype. Right? That soul program fundamentally is about learning how to take full responsibility for his own inner emotional reality and dealing with those deeper wounds of not being seen, not being cared for, not being important. All right, Pluto and Leo in the 4th is that need. I need to be the special. I need to be cared. I need to be important to you, and I'm not. That's devastating for a child. And then opposite the moon in Aquarius in the 10th house, how am I building a complex, right, moon, to emotionally cope and deal with this? Well, I'm going to become my own adult, my own person, and sort of dissociate and disconnect from the world and not care as much, right? There's a sort of emotional dissociation here. And of course, he became famous. It's very interesting to note, when he was in the height of the Beatles, he had his first son. It was an unintended pregnancy. And he wasn't there for his son at all, right? He was an absent father, Aquarius in the 10th house, emotionally cold and distant and unavailable. So he wasn't there for his own son. Again, this is the example where we often find those two dynamics. This is a dynamic within his own soul. When he had a second son with Yoko, he was deeply there. And the experience of actually being a caretaker, and in some ways, he was a lot more of the caretaker and nurturer than Yoko was. Right? He was meeting that need of his to experience a strong bonding. He was with his son, his second son, I forgot his name, a lot. Was deeply involved and physically present with him, caring for him, holding him, with him a lot of the time, which was the complete opposite of his first son, right? And it's just really helpful to understand that and see these chart dynamics. We're looking at an integration right here, right? It's that need, both Aquarius, Moon, and the 10th, it has a need for freedom. I got to be my own person. I don't want to be limited or defined by some sort of role or rule. Of course, this was a very individuated soul in terms of he was very sensitive in general on a societal 10th house level to a lot of the cultural and patriarchal distortions and corruption, etc. On a personal level, there's that need to, I want to feel like I can be myself, but I also want to feel cared for and loved and wanted. Okay? He was playing that out and working that out via his two children. So again, just a really good example to see those dynamics at play. And there's a lot to say around his strong bonding with Yoko versus his relationship to his first wife, which he was not very psychologically kind, and there was a lot of abuse, right? He psychologically, emotionally provided the very opposite to what he provided to his second son in Yoko with what he did with his first wife and his first child, right? So he was playing out all of these dynamics and resolving it through these familial relational experiences, as we all do as well. So let's look at another example. Edgar Allan Poe, right? I find this is a good example just in terms of exemplifying the need for catharsis, right? He had a Moon-Pluto conjunction in the 5th house. Pluto is also the ruler of his North Node. He had a really tough childhood too. I don't know his biography as well, but I understand his parents died early in life as well. And so there's a lot here around abandonment, feeling. This is like the orphanage, right? Pluto, Pisces in the fifth house. I'm a little child and no one's there to see me or love me or care for me. That's sort of that archetype to kind of give it a greater expression. His poetry, his art, his writing was so deep, so deep. If you just think of Edgar Allan Poe and you know nothing about him, you'll just know, oh, that was deep and dark stuff. That's what everyone knows without knowing anything about the soul, okay? So I just wanted to express that because through his art, he was able to create a lot of catharsis emotionally for that moon Pluto. And it's Pisces, obviously very spoke to the imagination. His work is universal. He would be a great person. If you study his work and just learn more about him, you will immediately get a feel for that moon Pluto. Okay, final example, I was fascinated to see this. Carl Jung. And why this was of interest to me, he has a moon Pluto balsamic conjunction in Taurus in the third house. He's known for the Red Book, which basically for many years of his life, while he's seeing clients, while he's teaching and traveling, at night he would be cataloging his own internal psychological processes. Deep, deep, deep work in delving deeply into his own unconscious. This is Taurus, moon Pluto in the third house. He literally created a physical book, Taurus, where he wrote on his own, self-navigating Taurus, his own journey in being able to objectify and understand his own internal emotional processes by delving deeply into the unconscious. Just again, a really great example of a soul that's working with deep psychological content through creating an avenue. You know, and this is essentially what I'm wanting to end this class with. We have to do something with our emotional content, right? Our moon Pluto content. It needs to be transmuted. Because what's happening is we're coming to terms with complexes and psychological dynamics that we're not aware of being there. Because the first thing that we do with the moon is we form our ego structure in a way that allows us to maintain safety. We have to go underneath it and be able to connect to the deeper emotional content in order to actually purge it and move through it and build a healthy self-image and actually evolve. And so it's helpful to understand that, and this is a Pluto thing in general, but really strongly with the moon, the content that we're not moving will consume us. We will be possessed by the emotional content that we're not somehow working out and processing because it's operating. The way to actually move it is by giving it some kind of external expression or creative movement or space for catharsis that allows us to become more self-aware of it and thus to learn more about who we are and to evolve. Okay, so let's now take a look at any more of the comments and see if there's any more questions that I can attend to. And as I'm doing this, reminder everyone that my training program begins in a few weeks. If you are resonating with these teachings and want to go deeper, my training program is an opportunity to study this work from the very beginning. Beginners, those who are already more practiced, anyone that's drawn to this work, it's incredibly valuable to start from the beginning, to receive guidance and support in your studies, for me to be a part of an inclusive and loving community that shares a similar interest in this work. So check it out in the description. It's always going to be available. In 2024, the next course begins mid-March. But we always have a self-study program available that you can study all of this content on your own and then join any of the live cohorts whenever these live cohorts begin. So for those watching now, if you're interested in tuning in more, you're also welcome to talk to me about it and see if this is a fit for you. Okay. And if anyone has any creative ideas for how I can track questions, maybe I can have someone doing that for me and kind of collecting the notes. Maybe that would be a cool thing. Someone who wants to volunteer. Can you speak to what part of the soul actualization involves learning to use the voice? I'm not sure what the context of that question is. Would you say a strong Pluto moon implies trauma? No. It could imply trauma. And that's actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because it doesn't implicitly imply trauma. And I would never look at a strong Pluto moon aspect and say, oh, there's early life trauma. I'm so glad you said that, because I wanted to bring this point up. Never look at a chart and make an assumption. There are many other people who have the same charts that we each have. And those karmic dynamics and the evolutionary necessity implied in those charts are being played out in a different way, right? It's according to the soul's program. So Jeff Green often said, the chart reflects the reality of the soul. We want to make sure we're accurately and responsibly interpreting the chart according to the actual soul reality. So even a Moon-Pluto square, it doesn't necessarily mean trauma in the traditional understanding of trauma. Obviously, there's an evolutionary process that's working out in the same way that it doesn't mean one of your parents was manipulative or emotionally unavailable, right? You could have a Moon-Pluto square and have a parent that themselves is doing the deep emotional work and actually is emotionally empowered and is deeply present and available, right? And the Moon-Pluto is simply the content that you're going to be working out. But in your soul program, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to come about in a particular way, the way it'll happen for others. And it doesn't necessarily mean trauma. I would say in general, if we really get to the heart of it, Moon-Pluto as a whole says, well, we have to face our darkness, right? We have to face the content that we haven't fully healed yet, and that's going to be difficult on some level, even if it's a trine. Yes, it is recorded. This will be up on my YouTube channel very soon. We'll talk about Pluto Sun next week. Okay. I answered that, Barbara, I spoke to that. Made a Pluto moon indicate a mother? It could be, yeah. Yeah. If you didn't catch the beginning, those are very common possible expressions of a moon Pluto. But again, not always. It's not always just that way. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. And also, there has been a request for transcription. So if anyone wants to do that, if that feels supportive for your own learning and wants to make that available as a service to others, talk to me about that. I think having transcription content is very helpful for those that are not familiar with the English language. So get in touch. All right, everyone, we'll be back next week for Pluto Sun.